Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ivan Rodrigues, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you today. As a tsunami of disruptions rising from the global economic slowdown and the COVID-19 pandemic inundated global economies, the Times of India Group has taken the responsibility of rewiring our understanding of a world in flux through the India Leadership Series, a series of interactions with stalwarts across sectors and industries spanning over 60 days in collaboration with ServiceNow. Today's Pharmaceutical Roundtable, titled The Pandemic Catalysation, India on its way to becoming the world's pharmaceutical nerve center, and technologies that will become a catalyst in making the world connected and safer, will focus on immediate challenges, opportunities, and decisions required to steer the sector out of choppy waters with an aim to revitalize one of the greatest economies in the world, India. Doyens from the sector will deliberate not just on what it will take to navigate through this crisis, but also shed light on what companies in this sector will need to do to emerge victorious in a new world order. It is our belief that the words of wisdom from the respected members of this roundtable will help many peers to rethink and rework their strategy to sail through these challenging times. And so, without further ado, it's an honor and privilege for me to welcome the members of this roundtable. Aditi Kare Panandikar, Managing Director, Indoco Remedies. Welcome, Aditi. Amit Chopra, Managing Director, India and South Asia, Thermo Fisher Scientific. Amit, welcome to this roundtable. Dr. Murtaza Khurakiwala, Managing Director, WOCAD. Welcome, Dr. Khurakiwala. Shrihas Tambe, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Biocon Biologics. Welcome, Shrihas. And Venugopal Arcot, fondly known as Venu, Senior Director, Solution Consulting, ServiceNow. Welcome, Venu. This roundtable will be moderated by Himanshu Vats, Consulting Editor, The Economic Times. Himanshu, over to you.
Thanks, Ivan. I'm delighted to be hosting such a distinguished panel in such astonishing times that the country and the world is going through. You know, the times where people believe anything can happen to anybody, anytime. And the pharma world is on everybody's radar screen. The common man has strong views on the world of medicines and vaccines, as well as what doctors, pharma companies, and policymakers are doing and should do. Pharma companies have been at the heart of all this, but very few people realize that they are also going through astonishing times. They are managing sudden spurt and collapse of demand for various products. They're managing a huge politicized environment. They're managing complex supply chains in a fairly risky environment. So I'm privileged to be hosting such a distinguished panel of people. In the course of the next hour or so, we'll hear from them about what the experience has been, what have been the lessons learned, where the Indian pharma sector stands in the world, and what's the look ahead. So welcome again, everybody. Aditi, can we start with you? What's been the last 2 years like, last year and a half? How challenging has it been?
None of us had expected a pandemic to hit us, obviously, and the challenges have been unprecedented. Let me start with the first lockdown. I mean, we sensed, because of what we were hearing from China, and there was a lot of preparatory work going on. And one morning in March, we just called the senior team together and said, look, there is every chance we just have to all work from home. And then within 48 hours, the IT guys set up a work environment for 6,000 Indocoites to work from home. So kudos to them. And we really, for the first week, we were grappling with the smallest thing, as small as moving a truck carrying goods from manufacturing sites to the central warehouse, as simple as that. because from the center at the state level, there was a kind of a chaos on what is lockdown and what is not, what is essential and what is not. So we had truck drivers who were given contact points to call up logistics. And somebody very senior would then pick up the phone and explain these are medicines which need to be allowed to move ahead. But very surprising is that literally just 5 or 6 days, we had this kind of a chaotic thing. And soon we adapted. And the learnings from the first lockdown was so great that in the second lockdown, much of the issues surrounding supply chain, availability of goods were pretty much taken care of. And I think the sector, therefore, sort of went through a huge learning curve. For us, for the sector in toto, it has of course been very challenging because suddenly health and safety for all became the need of the hour. And possibly a lot of things we were, as a population, taking for granted were being questioned. Medicines had to be made available. We had sudden spurts, as you said, of demand of certain kind of antibiotics, certain kind of peripheral to COVID products. And suddenly your so-called legacy star products just did not move. So it was a very challenging environment for a company like ours, which has 60% of the top line still coming from India. The very fact that for a greater part of the year, a sales rep has not been able to go and meet the doctor to create demand by way of generating prescriptions, and how sales and top line get impacted in this kind of eventuality has been a very, very interesting journey. I will, given an opportunity later, speak a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Aditi. You made an interesting point of people not being able to see a doctor and generate demand. But we also had so many people going themselves to chemist shops and buying all kinds of vitamins, even steroids and various things. And I turn to Dr. Murtaza. What has been your experience? You have a great company dealing in a very challenging environment.
Yeah, thank you, Himanshu, and thank you, Economic Times, for having this wonderful event. Uh, I think I would like to share a couple of thoughts. One is, I think the whole idea that we can work from home and yet be, by and large, effective as a thought process has kind of sunk in our minds and made us realize that what was the normal earlier, there is a new normal. And one can really adjust, adapt, and be flexible. And that's what was a great learning, I think, for all of us working from home. And now, when we have to return back to work, probably it is another new normal that we have to face. And because we are so set working from home, so now we have to again readjust and go back to work. So, but the ability to adapt and be flexible, I think that was one great learning from a human behavior point of view. In terms of various challenges that we had, I think initially we had logistic challenges, supply chain challenges, manufacturing disruption was there in the quarter 1 of last year. But that soon got resolved. And what remains, I think, is the demand-related challenges that are there. As Aditi pointed out, initially our medical reps had to create demand without meeting the doctors. And even today, that is to that extent disturbed. So how do we create demand without physically meeting the doctors? So digital working, digital interaction, digital way of meeting doctors. So that was an entire new learning experience for us. Demand challenges was more severe actually for us in US and UK, where because of the impact of COVID, there was a huge about 30-40% reduction in prescriptions and in terms of demand of the product portfolio that we had. So in fact, our demand issue was more outside India than in India. In terms of opportunities, I think it was also very interesting for us because of our presence in UK over the last 20 years and being one of the largest suppliers to NHS in UK, we were able to get a very early contract with the government of UK for manufacturing the vaccine. And so today we are manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine in UK. and we are doing the fill and finish, and we've got about a 2-year contract with the government. And very happy to share that because of the partnering with the government, we have supplied more than 50% of the vaccine to the UK population from our facility. So that has been, in a way, a great opportunity for us to participate in the pandemic, and in terms of being the solution to provide vaccination to the UK population. And one then looks at how we can expand that and enlarge our participation and see from India what we can do. So I think that was a great positive. Rest of it, I think, uh, remains the same. We have to stay our course, and wherever vaccine related business and opportunity is there, we look at what best can be done.
Yeah, many people are waiting for some announcement from you on this direction of what you're doing in India. Can I turn to Amit? Apart from working from home and erraticness in demand, are there other opportunities on the positive side also, which a company like yours might have seen, or overall for the pharma sector in India, navigating the risks in the past year and a half?
So thanks, Himanshu, and once again, thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. We've had very similar challenges to, I think, what Aditi and Dr. Paratiwala just mentioned. But I would like to add a couple of interesting areas. One, of course, is, as you know, Thermo Fisher is, in addition to our pharma services business, we are also involved in many other businesses, and predominantly a supplier to the pharmaceutical industry of services and products. And I think the other area that we got extremely involved in was diagnostics. And in the COVID response, about 50% of the global RT-PCR testing, directly or indirectly, has had our involvement, both in terms of the testing kits, the raw materials, as well as the instruments themselves. I would say that in India, we experienced extreme supply chain challenges. On the one hand, I still remember the third week of March, when we had tremendous pressures to bring lakhs of kits to India, and on the other hand, we had no way to ship them around. So I want to share the story with you that we actually hired a few Innova vehicles in Bangalore, hired a few personal drivers, and actually moved kits around using those vehicles because there was no flights from Bangalore, there was no transportation company working, there was nothing, including Air India or Indian Air Force or other emergency supplies that we tried to connect with. So extreme pressure on supply chain. In some areas that extreme pressure still continues, although that is easing now. For example, the Defense Production Act that the US government initiated meant that our supply chain for the biologics industry was effectively being controlled by the US government. That's easing off, thankfully, now, and therefore supplies have eased up. So we've had to deal with, to make sure that while we deal with the pandemic, the new norms of working from home, we also are able to the best of our ability, support our customers, especially since they're so dependent on the things that we do. I would say the second area I want to point out, of course, is that our team has also been, like many other teams, exposed to extreme safety risks, because we make thousands of service calls to COVID testing labs, to COVID testing hospitals, so pretty much like frontline healthcare workers. And we've had to make sure that while we execute and deliver, we also take extreme steps to ensure the safety of our own employees. So that's certainly been two areas I wanted to highlight.
It's interesting, even a company involved in testing faced such supply chain glitches. I was just curious, how far did the Innovas travel in the absence of other means?
So we actually had the Innovas travel from Bangalore to Pune, because we had to deliver those kits to NIV. And then we had another set of Innovas which traveled from Bangalore to Mumbai, and then we managed to get a flight from Mumbai to Delhi to deliver them to ICMR. So So those were the kinds of things we did last year.
Okay. Talking of supply chain, I think Venu has a good perspective on how supply chains work in such a risky environment. What were your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Manshu. And I think most of the panelists here mentioned about supply chain between the critical chain. This has been like Pharma 4.0, whichever we talked about automation in many different ways. But this forced us to look into automating this particular space from left to right, from suppliers to the shipping, to the carriers, to the warehouse, to the manufacturing unit, to the dealers, and to the end customers. There were a lot of contact points. There were a lot of papers that was involved. So where we helped our customers in working through these is about how do we convert those workflows? Because when you talk about each of these entities, from suppliers, there is a supplier third-party risk management associated with it, because who were suppliers were no more suppliers with the pressure of financial pressure coming upon them. The second was in terms of the carriers. When they landed on the shipping on the ports, there were no drivers to take the shipment from there. And then the warehouse itself, there was could not be accessed in many different ways. Manufacturing plant had to have a new norm into the regulatory, which is about the protocol about 50% or 30% into attendance. There's a new normal into the regulatory itself, a highly regulated industry. At the end of the day, voice of customer matters. So to do all of these things in a very synchronized manner, and we call this as connected enterprise. How do you make this connect happen was one of the important conversations. And below them, there were so many systems that were helping them to make this happen, whether it is track and trace, or whether to manage the stocks, or a machine running in a plant and requires maintenance, because non-maintenance costs a lot of damage as well. So we were helping in each of these dots, talking to each of these persona and making those lives change there. And I'm thankful to this industry, which has been the fulcrum of lifeline for all of us. Thank you again, Manshu.
Thank you. Thanks, Venu. So, India has been in the limelight for a variety of reasons, ranging from the number of cases India has had, the India being a major global source for vaccines. So that brings me to my next question. Where does India stand globally? How does the world look at it? On one hand, we regularly, I won't say regularly, but once in a while, we have news items about concerns in US about how manufacturing is done in India. And we also have some shining examples. I think Dr. Korakiwala mentioned himself that how much his company has contributed in the US. So I'll start with you, Dr. Korakiwala. What do you think about India standing globally in the pharma sector?
I think if we see the last 20 years, we have really done a commendable job in terms of globalizing the pharma industry. Domestically, we have a very strong pharma industry where about 80-85% of the Indian industry is served by local domestic firms. And over the last 20 years, our Indian manufacturers and Indian pharma companies have globalized. If you see that in generic medicines in the US, products manufactured in India have about 40% market share. And US is one of the most competitive markets. So if you take that as a barometer of how Indian pharma has done globally, it has done extremely well. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think one of the area is how we move up the value chain. So from being only a generic supplier of pharmaceutical globally, can we move up the value chain into biosimilars, biologics, and drug discovery of new innovative molecules? If we see the overall pharma market globally, which is about $1.2 trillion, 70 to 80% of that market is in innovative medicine. And that is where I think pharma industry needs to look at, and we all need to develop ourselves to move up the value chain from being a generic supplier to more innovative medicines. And I think we have the capabilities to do that. We have a very strong technical manpower and resources in India. We are very cost competitive. We have advantages over there. And we need to put it together now that one has acquired a certain level of scale and mass. One can invest into R&D and develop innovative products. So I think we are well positioned, I think, to move up the value chain. Additionally, I think in terms of vaccine, we have 60% of the vaccine production from India serving the global markets, WHO, and especially the lower income countries. And I think in the COVID pandemic and the requirement of huge amount of vaccine, which is for a population of 7 billion, about 15 billion doses are required. So that is another area where the Indian pharma has a opportunity to play an important part in serving the global vaccine requirement, especially during COVID time.
Okay. Shreyas Tambe, let me turn to you. Dr. Korakiwala made an important point about, moving up the value chain towards the more innovative and new molecules. I'd like to hear from you, how well positioned is India to make that shift? And also your views on, if you have anything new to add to what other panelists have said on the experience of the pharma industry for the last year and a half. Yeah.
I think just going back to what Aditi started out by saying, the events of 2020 were certainly unprecedented. I mean, the kind of challenges that we faced, not just as a company or a country, I don't think were expected at all. And for those who thought that we were insulated or infallible, I think the pandemic has been a great leveler. It's basically, it's really ravaged everything. It's impacted lives, and the biggest teaching is protecting life is probably as important as protecting livelihood. So the livelihood part is what we are addressing subsequently, but certainly the investments that need to go into improving public health have been probably the biggest learnings in the last 2 years. Now, coming specifically to what has India done, I think it's important to understand the challenge that we're dealing with at hand here. In India, when we talk about a mass immunization program, we're talking about a 1.3 billion population, which is just to contrast it, is all of US, the 27 countries of European Union, Russia, Brazil, Mexico, all of it put together, and you are looking at what India is. So by any standards, you are looking at a very, very significant program at hand. What has the pharmaceutical sector done so far? I mean, we've been able to get over 250 million doses to people in India, which is second only to the US, which has been able to get 310 million doses. Now, if you were to compare this to the UK, that's a 72 million doses, and that constitutes to 61% of their eligible population. So for the 250 million doses that the Indian pharmaceutical industry has been able to support the eligible population in India, that constitutes to 14% only. Now, could we have done better? Well, the answer is certainly yes. But have we come along reasonably well? That answer is reasonably okay as well. Now, why did this happen? This happened because whether it was Oxford or whether it was AstraZeneca who came to India to get these vaccines manufactured, was because Serum Institute in Pune is the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world by volume. The example of Bharat Biotech is chronicled as the Made in India example of innovation. So certainly the pharmaceutical sector has really moved up the value chain. It's seen opportunity overall, like you'd see, whether it was testing that Amit talked about before, where I think Thermo Fisher did a fantastic job in getting it approved and getting it across to India. But companies in India like my lab got indigenized test kits developed. For treatment protocols, companies like ours, Biocon Biologics, repurposed products like itolizumab, which was a scientific ingenuity at play, where they were approved for psoriasis, but then really helped COVID patients with acute respiratory distress and saved thousands of lives. Prophylaxis I just talked about in terms of the vaccine contribution. So I would say the image overall of the pharmaceutical industry and its place in the global marketplace is certainly moved from being just a low-cost destination to a sustainable innovation hub, which with the right kind of support ecosystem that through the various government programs can certainly has potential to go beyond.
Okay. Aditi, do you agree India has emerged as a sustainable innovation hub, and that actually, India needs much more credit for what it has done, as Shreyas said, given the comparison of the population of US, Europe, Mexico, everyone put together. What are your thoughts? I think you're also mute. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm actually reminded of this one TED talk I had attended when they spoke of innovation out of India and Indians being able to innovate. It was quite funny actually, because if you look at the scientists in pharma sector across the globe, whether in US or Europe or anywhere in the world, more than 60% of them are of Indian origin. And most of the big pharma have R&D centers operating out of India. So when we say Indians need to get into more innovative product, I think let's be very clear, we are talking of Indians being able to own the innovation they do. And that is a very important point, and that is where I agree with Shreyans, is that, it's in pharma, the hit rate of converting a R&D product, especially if it's a new chemical entity or a difficult or super generic, the chances are that you'll be spending a lot of money and not able to convert every opportunity into a successful launch or a commercially viable product. How many of Indian companies can afford to get into this? And that is where we get in. And while it is very, very important to get support from the government, I think, in order to support the Indian pharma sector. It's not about capability at all. It's about being able to financially create models which encourage industry to get into innovation. Over the last couple of decades, especially post-liberalization, we saw the Indian pharma sector completely use all its capabilities it had developed in reverse engineering, whether it was for APIs, generic formulation, because of the years of no patent on product, So we had developed these great capabilities, which we were able to encash upon. And when the world needed a manufacturer, we were there. Eventually, when the world needed us to develop, also we have been there. It's just that the research has not been owned by Indian companies. And I think that is where we need to concentrate, especially post-COVID, when most governments are looking at a national agenda. When you want to depend less on others, I think to be able to do is okay, but to be able to develop and do and own the development, I think that is where we are headed. So in 5 years, I feel looking at the kind of products the top 5 to 10 Indian companies have in their pipeline, many of them working on NCEs, we can aspire to have a lot of research coming out of India. But there is a thriving mid-size, MSME and small sector also with great capabilities. And if the government is able to plan a good program, I feel we will be able to see many more products come out of research pipelines from India.
Okay. Amit, you think lots of products would come out of the research pipeline in India, especially in testing? And how has been India standing in the world in the course of this pandemic?
So I think, I want to just, share with some thoughts with you there. I think the work that the government has done, especially when you look at the Department of Biotechnology in spurring innovation in the country across life sciences, and that focused on testing, focused on diagnostics, on medical devices, not core pharma, but I think it's outstanding work that's being done. I think we have incubators like the C-Camp incubator in NCBS, which is incubated more than 100 companies, is involved with so much innovation and so much industry partnerships. It's just, I think it's going to be in the next 5 years, hopefully, we will see many more, startups and unicorns emerge from that ecosystem. So I think the work, the DBT is setting sort of a great roadmap for what other ministries and other parts of our scientific community can do in sort of fostering the culture of innovation and supporting it. When I look at specifically testing, I think tremendous work has been done by Indian entrepreneurs. Shreyas talked about my lab. There have been many others who have done a great job in localizing, in indigenizing, in developing innovative solutions. I think the challenge, of course, there is how do these entrepreneurs scale up, and how can MNCs or other big Indian companies partner with them, and that's a different conversation. But certainly a huge amount of innovation has happened. It has also attracted, interestingly enough, global funds. For example, the Rockefeller Foundation has supported innovation in diagnostic testing for COVID in India by giving grants of $8 to $9 million. So a lot of excitement happening. I think as you unleash the entrepreneurial energies in the country, we should see even more innovation happen in our space, and certainly I'm completely in agreement with Aditi's views that I think, and Dr. Farakiwala's views, that the next steps should be India moving up the value chain and becoming much more of an innovator rather than just producer of biosimilars and generics.
Okay, thanks. Venu, do you share this optimism of so many small companies, startups, MSMEs coming up, and they would have challenges to scale up? Your thoughts, please.
I think Mr. Murtaza has a point to make. Had his hand raised. Murtaza, do you want to make your point before I step in? You're muted.
No, please go ahead, Venu. I'll come in after that.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I think Amit made a very important point about unicorns, and 6 unicorns in health tech valued about $1 billion each emerged in 2019. There were almost like 50% of acquisition by big pharma companies in 2019 were software companies. So what is it driving? It is driving towards a tech-centric industry, that more and more of technology is going to enable the life cycle of how the acquisition happens, the manufacturing happens, the distribution happens. So I think these are key areas where tech plays a very important role, and that's these statistics says. But what is more important is that there is intensification in terms of patient-centric healthcare. What I mean is that even for critical care, like cancer and other treatment where serum was used by some of the large pharmaceutical companies, and various other treatments were going through, and supply chain made a very important role, because time to collecting the sample and medication was important, and it touches various systems across it. But during this time, we've seen that how personalization of healthcare was very important, because it was so unpredictable about what is going to happen next, about the treatment that is being given now, then and later. There's always a question mark, and this caused anxiety, and that anxiety caused into much more severe implications for each individuals. Probably these are the areas that one has to focus on in terms of what I hear from some of the industry leaders like the panelists here: personalization of medicine and specialty products. The value chain, we talked about a lot about shifting left in terms of R&D. Value chain shifts beginning from clinical trials and how do we make it happen. There are new entrants. I think Shreya has also mentioned about so many new entrants. And this is also a competition, but it also in ways many competition as well. But there is a need for interoperability between these entities to work together to make the progression in line with what the industry wants. Last but not the least, regulation plays a very important role. And regulation and this industry, when they want to go on the left side of in terms of putting some step forward, there will be 3 steps backward in terms of how the regulation plays a role in that. So to work around with this, technology plays an important role in terms of managing the entire chain. So that's my viewpoint, Mangshu.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Karakiwala.
Yes, I just wanted to share our own experience and effort in innovation and drug discovery development. So we started our drug discovery development at Wockhardt in early 2000s, and our main focus was on antibiotic segment. So over the last 20 years, now we have 4 molecules in clinical development and at various stages in phase 1, phase 3 development. One of the molecules, in fact, 2 molecules we introduced in India last year during COVID time, incidentally. And all the molecules we have developed are for resistant organisms. So where there is a unmet medical need and where the organism is resistant to existing antibiotics. So we have developed new antibiotics that will be effective against these organisms. And we have a couple of molecules in gram positive, couple of molecules in gram negative. And this is what we plan to do. 2 of these products we plan to take globally for global clinical development, and the other 4 products we are going to develop for India and emerging markets. So I think innovation, this is one area where we found that we could do it, and we have done it over last 20 years. But as you know, research is a long drawn process. It takes a lot of time, uh, and the hit rate and success rate is fairly low. It requires a persistent effort to succeed and a significant amount of investment and an appetite to take risk. I feel the government can also play a very important role in this and create a very enabling environment for research and development in the country. Given the talent pool that we have, the capabilities that we have, and the strength in the pharmaceutical industry, a very active and visionary kind of a policy to make India a strong innovator in R&D in terms of pharma and life sciences, aided by a government support, infrastructure, developing the R&D ecosystem, I think can play an also very important part in creating a springboard for even more innovation at a global level.
Okay. It's fascinating, for me to hear you tell us about molecules being developed. I say fascinating because I remember early in my career in the 90s, Dr. Parvinder Singh of Ranbaxy once told me that I don't know how can India move up the chain. It's the big companies who have the big money who can invest in molecules. And it's a huge journey to reach that place. So it's really nice that you are at that level, and so are some other Indian companies. So that's really good. I want to turn to a next question, an open-ended question to all the panelists. Does India's pharma sector need to be immunized, vaccinated, in whatever sense? Who'd like to come in first?
Well, I would say, as I said earlier, I don't know whether we need to be immunized. We have been fairly strong, I think, in developing as an industry over the last 40, 50 years. And we have demonstrated that not only in the Indian market, but globally in terms of our competitive strength, our position. What I think will be helpful from overall point of view is moving up the value chain and moving from purely a generic player to innovative medicines. And that is where, as an industry, now that we have got a certain level of mass and scale, naturally the Indian companies would do that. But creating this enabling environment with the support of government in terms of financial incentive, in terms of regulatory aspect, and creating a vision for India to become an important player in creating innovation from India, I think can go a long way in developing that industry. So I would not say immunize, we don't need any immunization as an industry, but encouragement and support will definitely help.
Okay. Aditi, you were about to say something.
Yeah, so I guess when you meant does the sector needs immunity? To some extent, yes. Post the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the major areas everybody has been focusing on is to make the industry self-reliant on the APIs or the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or at least specifically the key starting materials or KSMs. And there are many sectors of pharma where we depend hugely on the starting material coming from China. If one has to look at the root cause of why the dependency on China increased for the active pharmaceutical industry, it has origins in how in China, government gave a huge support system, whether it was to encourage a fermentation industry, biotech, whether it is by way of offering utilities very cheap. Even today, if you look at the cost of utilities like electricity or whatever it costs to maintain pollution free or non-pollutant industry, the costs associated with these industries in India are extremely high. The consequence of that was an API industry, which anyway had a low return for investment kind of a scenario. Once China started offering material at costs lower than our cost of manufacturing, and this, coupled with the fact that whatever you made for use in India were anyway, the medicines were being capped because of the price control from the government side. So on one side, you want to give cheap product to the Indian population. On the other side, you have goods coming from China, which are far more affordable than the product made in India for consumption as raw material. This resulted in, there are several sectors, including a lot of antibiotics, penicillin, and some others where nobody makes them in India anymore. They're just sourced from China. So China was able to create this scale of manufacturing, aided by a lot of support from the government. You must have heard of the new PLI schemes that the Indian government has come up with for aiding, and they now realize that it is very much required to support the active pharmaceutical industry in India if one has to, make the Indian and the global industry not reliant. There is globally now an understanding of a terminology called China plus one. And there are many Indian players who are wanting to be that plus one. And the world believes we can do it because the capabilities were always there. What is required now is this phase, and government has begun to look at it. It's just going to take some time. So how things pan out over the next 7, 8 years, 10 years, how quickly we can turn around some of these advantages that are being offered to the industry, this is going to matter a lot, going forward. This is what I wanted to add.
Okay, thanks, Aditi. Amit, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think Aditi's made some excellent points, and I won't repeat them. But I'd like to add in the same vein. When we look at China, and I'm just sharing with you from our perspective, from our lens, we look at a country which has evolved biotech, and I'm talking specifically on the biotech part of biopharma part of the industry, the biopharma industry, which is almost about 5 to 6 times bigger than what we have today, and with probably 3 times as many startups that we see in that space. The rate of innovation, in fact, if when we look at APAC, Asia Pacific, the rate of the next bet on innovative molecules or biomolecules is really China. And I'm sharing with you perspective not from me, but from what I hear across the industry in terms of the way that industry has grown. When we look at other emerging frontiers in therapeutics, for example, cell and gene therapy, again, almost a fourth of the startups and companies which are working on this area are actually in China, in the world. And in India, we have 2. So I think that's one aspect of sort of immunization or looking at the reality around us, which is that on the one hand we're competing with the Koreas of the world, which have huge CDMOs, scale, companies like Celltrion and Samsung. On the other hand, we have this very, very highly innovative ecosystem emerging in China. The third aspect that is an interesting thing we need to watch out for is that when we look at pharmaceutical services and when we look at the CDMO sector and contract research and development, there is an expression, from many of the big pharma that they want to actually bring those technologies and that manufacturing back into Europe and North America for whatever reasons. So when we think about the 5 to 10 year horizon for our industry, I think these are things we're going to have to contextually watch out for, that how will these impact, and are these genuine trends, are they going to impact us? If so, how do we respond to them as a country? And I think the comments that Aditi made are absolutely spot on, that the PLI scheme is a great step forward in bringing back and incentivizing local production of APIs. And I think we need to think about what else do we need to do and where else can the government step in, to really unleash the entrepreneurial energies that our country has.
Thanks. Shreyas, how optimistic are you on the next 5 years and your thoughts on immunization of the industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I know we've talked about China being a cause for concern, and Aditi is right. There was certainly that area because 60% of our pharmaceutical imports come from China, and 70% of those are in the API, key starting materials or drug intermediate space. And the government has, through the Atmanirbhar Bharat vision, taken steps to address that. And the PLI scheme is a great example of it. But that's not the only story. That's only part of the story. If you were to look at the biologics ends, where Biocon Biologics would operate and some other players do, the threat is not necessarily only China. The threat is from the US, where you saw many of the vaccine is a biological. Many of the vaccine productions couldn't move. Many of the monoclonal antibody programs couldn't move in most of the world because there was a policy decision to prioritize local industry within the US. Diagnostic kits we talked about, and they couldn't be shipped across because the US had protectionist policies. As Amit talked about, things are easing up and they will hopefully get better. They are getting better. But this is clearly, not just China. This is across the world that we will have to be prepared for. Biologics manufacturing or development will eventually have to be self-sufficient in some way or the other. The Atmanirbhar Bharat or the PLI scheme is not just manufacturing. The good part of that PLI scheme is it covers research and development aspects. It promotes not just the area where it encourages companies developing global scale, but it also allows them to cover expenses towards product regulatory registration, which is a big expense that companies undertake. So if you really look at how the Made in India strategy has gone, I think it is not just looking inward, but if you extrapolate that, it's made in India for the world. And if you want to really look at that, and if you want to move up that curve that Dr. Murtaza talked about, moving from just a small molecules generics player with a low cost hub to moving up that curve towards a more innovation-led country or a space, then there are three basic aspects that I would look at that need to be focused on. One is the policy regulation aspect. That's the first area to look at. You need to have the right policies, the IP infrastructure, which encourages innovation, so that no company is fearful that its IP is infringed upon. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is related to supporting that kind of innovative thinking. I think there was a talk about the CCAMP initiative or the big grant, as they call it, through the Department of Biotechnology. Certainly right steps for incubating novel ideas, new startups, that could trigger the next wave of innovations. But that funding, I mean, if you look westwards, clearly there was a bigger kitty towards development of vaccines through the BARDA funding. Now that can, really take away the risk of developing products, and a buyback assurance of over $500 million. That can certainly incentivize organizations to look at innovation in a very different perspective. Dr. Parminder Singh was right. From where do you generate this? Because you're looking at low cost products. At the end of the day, you're looking at affordability. But then that affordability, that science, that development has to be backed by policy, regulation, and of course, funding. And the third more important aspect is administration of this, because you can have the right policy and you can have the right regulation and you can also have the right funding, but it could get misappropriated. And I think that's an area which could also then need to be monitored properly, that the funding and the policy is monitored in the right way, so that then you have an ecosystem where regulation is in place. Take an example of the vaccine approvals in recent time. I think the biggest gain of this was the entire clinical development cycle, which the regulators based decisions on science, and we were able to move forward so quickly. Repurposing of drugs. We've seen vaccines brought in with clinical data which was proven abroad. Certainly very, very positive steps for the industry. If you ask me the next 5-year outlook, I remain very, very optimistic, because clearly the pandemic has shown the capability. You look at the venture capital funding which has gone into the country. We come into the country recently. Look at the partnerships. Look at Novavax tying up recently with Serum Institute outside of the AstraZeneca partnership. Look at Baylor Institute and Johnson & Johnson with biologically. So clearly there is so much more to look forward to. And my outlook for the next 5 years would certainly be on the optimistic side of where this will be.
Okay, that's great to have such optimism. I'll come to Venu, and I also want to look at what have we learned about dealing with risk, because I think the biggest risks, the most influential events are the ones we do not anticipate, like this pandemic. And I'll request you to be brief as possible. We don't have much time, so that we can hear from other panelists also on the risk factor.
Sure.
And preparedness to deal with it.
Yeah, I think, am I going? Okay. I think risk is one area that you would see cutting across the enterprise, right? You can call it an enterprise risk, an operational risk, an IT risk, business risk, many different dimensions of it. But recognizing this much ahead of time makes the business much more predictable. One of the areas that Indian pharma industries, and as I hear from leaders, is about perception management. And this perception management about the industry itself and its operations can be highly leveraged through adverse event reporting. Through how does this event impact the quality and manufacturing data, probably connecting with patients directly and shifting away from traditional physician relationships. These are possibilities under perception management itself. This has direct implications on regulatory and compliance and risk management associated with it, because we are talking about personalization of data as well. And last but not the least, clinical trials, there is a risk associated with that. How do you mitigate that risk? And customer service experience with regard to risk associated with that. Transparency and collaborative and open framework help in making this possible, and hence connecting all of these dots is a very important aspect about managing it. Seeing what is coming ahead and managing it, having a plan for it, and I call it as action plus innovation is going to accelerate the process of risk mitigation.
Okay. Aditi, how are you going to manage risks, and any management lessons you've learned in the last year and a half?
Yeah, so pharma is a very resilient industry, but every few years we've had a new kind of risk evolve. Just adding to what Venu might have said, in the last 5 to 10 years, most of the Indian pharma, small and large, went through a huge perception and understanding of the regulatory risk. Especially with as you said, there is this perception of Indian manufacturing not being of standard. You said it right in the beginning. So there was it really was a perception risk, because since India has more A&D approved facilities than anywhere else in the world, it was to get its own share of trouble. So it was more of a probability or a number crunching thing, and not so much of it happens in India and doesn't happen anywhere else. So regulators sort of got tougher, changed their benchmarks. We weren't exactly caught napping, but the understanding that regulatory requirements are going to keep changing very fast, and we have to keep pace with that. The whole industry went through that learning and understanding, and that part got corrected. And then the COVID pandemic happened, which was a business risk which nobody had anticipated, right? So suddenly business and finance risk is no longer something which can be done one time a year to go into the annual report, and it suddenly has to be done all the time, anticipation of it. So a very dynamic kind of a culture inside the companies, I'm sure, will come in now to keep evaluating. As you rightly said, I mean, we have a product, Carval Plus, I talked about it possibly earlier, which suddenly became a hero from nowhere. I mean, and the risk associated with this for the company was, did we have stock? Could we comply? Could we supply? So risks of every kind suddenly generated, because COVID on one side created a lot of issues, because business, on one side of business, there was a lot of hampering. But on the other side, there was a sudden demand created for some of the key products for almost all companies. And we went through that. So risk, understanding risk, monitoring it, creating management triggers to anticipate risk. I think that's going to be very interesting in the post-COVID new normal. That's what I.
Dr. Korakiwala, what has been your experience in managing risk, and is the Indian pharma industry better prepared to face the unexpected?
I think overall, if you see, R&D is one area where the risk management comes into play. And there are 2 or 3 factors that play a role. One is, what is the kind of allocation that one does to R&D in terms of generic business and in terms of innovative business, which is basically a strategic decision where one can look at how we want to manage risk and return. So I think that at a strategy level in R&D, that is one risk management that is there. Second aspect of risk management is in terms of uncertainties which are beyond one's control. For example, COVID in this situation, or in terms of sometimes regulatory risk and FDA risk is there, and how do you manage the FDA and regulatory risk? So there are certain external risks which are there, and one has to manage it on a best effort basis at that point of time. But I think fundamentally risk management, which are more internal in nature, are revolving around R&D and regulatory. These are the 2 areas where maximum amount of strategic thinking is required in order to effectively manage it.
Okay, thanks. Shreyas, your thoughts on industry's preparedness to face the unexpected, briefly, please.
So I know we're running out of time, so I'll put it into 3 or 4 bullet points. I think what the second wave of pandemic has taught us, I'll limit it to that, and I'll say, clearly it has caught us by surprise. So what it tells us is that no matter which country you are in, which economy that is supporting it, you can't meet with a surge demand, which is kind of a quarter's worth of demand would be required. In 3 months, you need what is needed for over a 12-month. I don't think any company or any country can really manage that. We've seen that happen in the second wave. So my 3 things would be: prepare public infrastructure to manage that surge. That would be in that space. Second is regulatory speed based on science. That would be the second piece. The third piece would be that the hospitals, institutions, and state governments, central governments should stock up on supplies of critical life-saving drugs so that the industry is better prepared to meet with any surge of the kind that we saw. There is already a guidance that there could be a third wave, hopefully not, but if God forbid if there is, then we should be better prepared than we were for the second wave.
We all hope there won't be a third wave, but it's a complete imponderable. We have another 30 seconds and all of them to Amit.
Thanks. So now I think everyone's covered these points. Talking about surge, I just want to highlight a great example. We launched, domestic manufacturing of our COVID testing kit in February, and the idea was to, make an amount of X. We were flexible enough to establish capacities. And perhaps in hindsight, we got lucky or it was a prescient decision, but we ended up actually producing 4X. Now, what makes me very happy is that we could meet the country's demand with very high quality and very competitive product. But again, to Srihas's point, how do we build the surge capacity in a time of pandemic, not knowing exactly what's going to be utilized, whether it will be utilized or not. So I think that's a little bit of a leap of faith that one has to take for critical areas in the pandemic. So that's all I'd like to end with.
Right. Thanks, Amit, and thanks to all the panelists for really highlighting all the key critical areas of the sector and the way ahead, and leaving us with a positive frame of mind and optimism that here's an industry which can do it, given the right support, maybe the right inoculation, maybe the right guidance. Thanks very much for your inputs, and I'll hand over to Ivan.
Thank you, Himanshu. That concludes the Pharmaceutical Roundtable titled The Pandemic Catalysation, India on its way to becoming the world's pharmaceutical nerve center and technologies that will become a catalyst in making the world connected and safer. A big thank you once again to all the members of this roundtable: Aditi, Kare, Panandikar, Amit Chopra, Dr. Murtaza Khurakiwala, Srihas Tambe, and Venugopal Arcot for taking time off from their very busy schedules and sharing their insights and thoughts with us at this roundtable. Last but not least, a big thank you to Himanshu Vats for doing a fantastic job of moderating this panel. I think the greatest takeaway, if it were to be summed in one line, is that industries and companies in this sector are looking probably at, we've always heard the term business continuity planning, but I think with the waves, we've had two and probably a third wave lurking around the corner, we've got to look at pandemic continuity planning. Great to listen and learn from these bright minds and influential leaders talk about transforming organizations to achieve resilience, authenticity, and help one reach the stage of customer delight. I am sure we are leaving with some important takeaways. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe. Have a good day.